Very good morning. It is 10:19. You are watching and listening to Bev Turner Today on GB News. Thanks for joining us. Now, my panel are here this morning. I am so pleased to be joined by Emma Webb, UK Director at the Common Sense Society. Morning, Emma. And former Labour MP Stephen Pound. Right, this story, Stephen, I can't wait to hear what you think about this as a former MP. Yeah. There is an idea, a suggestion, that when MPs lose their seats, this is a Commons Administration Committee, they've called for a special ceremony for the MP and their family where they are presented with a medal by the Commons Speaker for their time in office, because apparently losing their seat can be an emotional and traumatic experience, and the noble enterprise of public office should be defended, encouraged and recognised. I think we sort of agree with that bit, possibly. I'm not sure about the ceremony. But then, as a goodbye for having only had £84,000 a year as salary, they should get a £100,000 payoff to say, I'm ever so sorry you weren't good enough for your constituents to vote for you. There you go, there's £100,000.
Well, I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be retrospective. That's my first thought. But the idea of getting a medallion... Well, obviously I do. I mean, at the end of the war, my dad got a number of medals, like virtually everybody. And the one medal that everybody got was just the active service medal, just as you got because you've been in active service. Yeah. The idea that we should actually get a medal, what for? For surviving, for being there. I mean, some of the greatest crooks and charlatans on God's green earth have been elected to Parliament.
Absolutely.
So rogues and rascals, and the idea of them queuing up, I won't mention the names, but I mean, I'm sure you can have them spinning around in your head.
Yeah.
And the speaker, but imagine if Burko had been the speaker at the time, and you've got some of the people in the expenses scandal, you've trousered God knows how much money. Here's a little gold medal, here's a Quality Street gold toffee. It's embarrassing. If there's any, on a slightly serious note, if there's one major problem that Parliament has nowadays, it's the disconnect between Parliament and the people. Can you imagine the typical voter looking at it and saying, gosh, do you know, I've totally changed my view on Parliament because they're going to give them 100 bags of sand and a nice little medal to wear, and then you're going to wear it in the street outside?
But
embarrassing.
Also, it's another one of those suggestions which completely neglects to factor in human behaviour, Emma Webb, because if you really do not like your MP and you don't want them to have a £100 bonus for losing, you're going to vote for them. It distorts the very notion of democracy.
What's wrong with this picture?
You get rewarded for losing.
Yeah, completely. That's a really good point that I hadn't thought of. I mean, obviously the whole thing is completely tone deaf, particularly under the current circumstances. I can't even believe that they have allowed this story to get into the press, because with all of the things that are going on at the moment, this is the last thing in the world that the public want to be hearing. I do think that there is a case for trying to attract a higher calibre of people into politics. But the point that has been made by James Roberts from the Taxpayers Alliance, and I think he absolutely nails it, he said that being elected to Parliament should be privilege enough.
Yeah.
And so, on the one hand, yes, you want to attract a higher calibre of people, because actually, in the grand scheme of things, £84,000 for some of the people who could go into politics is a much lower salary than they would be earning if they were, say, working in the private sector or working in finance or working in a bank or something. And those are the sort of people that we need to be encouraging to take part in public service. But on the other hand, you want people to do it because they believe in public service, that they believe that public service is a very important privilege in itself. And so the salary doesn't really matter to that. So you don't want people to be going into it because they have purely financial interest.
I don't think we should also be going... Speaking as an ex-sailor, hospital porter and bus conductor, I think, we have a bit of rough in Parliament as well. But what's interesting, Charles Walker, the chairman of Sir Charles Walker, he stood against me in 2001. And I have to say, he tried to report me for buying ice creams for a group of kids on the Drayton Green estate. He said I was treating... I doubled my majority.
Well done. But let me just think about this. So what is life like then as an MP, Stephen? You've got your £84,000 a year salary, but then you also get your property supplemented?
No, only very, very few people. Look, when I was first elected, I was the MP for Ealing North, which is about 40 minutes from Westminster. And yet, I could have claimed £23,000 a year for a second home. Indefensible. Now, this all came about because Margaret Thatcher, most problems actually go back to Margaret Thatcher in my experience.
Oh, I'd say Tony Blair, but never mind.
Well, there's a read across there. But,
they're not that dissimilar, actually.
No, the thing is, MP's salary, back in the 70s and the 80s, should have increased. She didn't want the public opprobrium of increases. So she said, listen, expenses are the answer. We could claim £200 a month for flowers in our offices. We could also, even if we had a second home, we could still claim for a hotel without any supporting evidence. All of that got swept out. And to be fair, when Tony Blair found out, for example, that we didn't get speeding tickets as MPs, the chief constable had to approve if you got a ticket for speeding, which of course nobody. So he wiped all that out.
So the expenses got cleaned up.
Yeah.
Maybe leaving MPs. Well, they're not out of pocket. 84 grand, and you can still claim quite a lot of expenses.
Well, the expenses are for your staff. That's the reality.
Which are generally wives and daughters and family members.
On occasion, that has been the case. Yes, but look,
one of the reasons that they give as well for this is saying that because MPs feel that it's almost like a consolation prize because they feel they've been hounded out for because of a brutal, toxic political culture. Well, this was created by the politicians themselves, right?
Yes, and it is politics. And, I mean, I would love better people to go into politics. I often sit with people on this desk and I think, why aren't you in politics? Why aren't you a politician?
And sometimes you look at me and say, why were you in politics?
Yeah, why aren't you a politician?
I like to be able to speak freely on my own behalf. And I think within the Conservative Party, there's obviously a lot of pressure on people to not promote conservative views. But also, I think the idea of sort of being whipped into voting for certain things and to having to take a particular party line is unappealing to a lot of people who are free thinkers, which is a problem because you need political parties to attract free thinkers so that you can actually come up with ideas that are slightly outside of the box and not the sorts of things that we have been seeing time and time and time again.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's within political parties never lasts very long.
So nobody's going to go into Parliament and say, I don't want to be an MP because it might be too horrible and toxic. There was that thing they found on Queen Elizabeth I's stagecoach where somebody had written, fain would I climb, yet fear I to fall. And somebody had written underneath, if thy heart faileth thee, climb not at all.
Well, where'd you get poetry like that, hey? Anyway.
On Queen Elizabeth I's stagecoach, written with a diamond.
On news channels on a Wednesday morning. Right, BBC public order bill. This is, Peers defeat plans to curb the protest disruption. This was announced late last night. So this public order bill that we've been talking about on and off, and it has this very controversial clause in there about serious public disorder, serious damage to property, serious disruption to the life of the community. If the protest might result in that, the police could restrict it. So what's happened, Emma? It went to the House of Lords and they've overturned quite a key part of it.
Yeah, I think the concern that has been aired by a lot of free speech advocates, including myself, is that whilst obviously some of these protests, like the Just Stop Oil protests, are a problem, and a lot of these people are doing things like committing criminal damage and putting people's lives at risk and so on, that was the reason why the government put forward some of these measures. But the concern has been, and I agree with this, and this is why I think this is good news, is that could very easily be misused to prevent protest, to prevent people from being able to air their views in a democratic, free society, something that we all believe in. But another aspect of this, I think, is really important, is that a lot of the things that are really causing the serious disruption, things like Just Stop Oil, putting people's lives at risk on the roads, or vandalism, these are all things that can be dealt with within the law. There's this tendency to always want to create more legislation, and that always leads to trouble further down the line. So we don't need this legislation. We need the current law to be properly enforced, and for the police to not be taking cups of tea to protesters sitting in the middle of the road and then leaving it to the public to take matters into their own hands so that they can get to work or take their children to school.
Absolutely. What do you think, Steve?
Well, it's an interesting thing. The House of Lords, and there's about 1,000 of them there, and this vote was actually 254 to 240. So it's quite a tight vote. So I don't think it's particularly clear-cut. Look, the government want to throw some red meat to the Tories. But here's an odd thing. If you want to have a demonstration in London, you don't just turn up and march from Trafalgar Square. You have to get the approval of City Hall and the police. So we have this strange situation where if we have the poll tax demonstration, the fox hunting demonstration, things like that, you actually get approval for it. You get license for the demonstration. But the thing about this is the Just Stop Oil people who've got a lot of time on their hands, they will come up with some ridiculous way around. But I think that something's got to be done. time, when you've got people slinging tomato soup, not at an Andy Warhol print, which is where you should be slinging it, but a Van Gogh. I mean, there's something wrong there. I think we've got to somehow balance it. I mean, I hate to sound sort of sensible about this, but in some ways, the right to protest, by all means, but let's not allow the M25 to be brought to a halt and people stop going to work.
Yeah.
And also about Charlotte Lynch, the reporter, who was actually arrested by the police on the M25. Yeah. Arrested. You know, if you're going to actually stop the press reporting these things, then you're on a slippery slope to a dictatorship. One of the first things dictators do is close down the state broadcaster and take you out and shoot you.
Yeah. And I think for me, Emma, as well, this story just shows it's one of those stories that, wow, we do need the House of Lords. They do hold these bills to account in a way that Parliament doesn't.
Absolutely. And I think there's a very good case against this idea of having an elected House of Lords, because you do need the checks and balances. Yeah. You can't just have a second House second House of Commons. That would completely undermine the entire point of having a second House. So the House of Lords have done brilliantly on this, and I think that there will be a lot of free speech advocates who are celebrating today. Yeah. And I as I very often do, I agree with Stephen, and I think that
resign.
I do think that a lot of this stuff, like the use of protests to justify criminality, to justify vandalism, as we saw with the Edward Colston statue being pulled down, or throwing things at, tins of soup at paintings and so on. That's something that doesn't require this legislation. We need to be very, very careful in the sorts of legislation that's being proposed right now, including the online safety bill, that those with good intentions are not accidentally paving the road to hell by introducing things that could have serious anti-democratic and anti-free speech implications.
Absolutely. Right, brilliantly summed up, guys. OK, now moving on after the break.